Well, it's the 60th anniversary of the March on Washington, the anniversary of Martin Luther King Jr.'s historic I Have a Dream speech. My name is Brittany Page, and this is the Page Perspective. Please remember to subscribe. You can also follow me on all of the socials, Threads, Twitter. We do not call it X in this house. Instagram and TikTok. One of my TikToks actually went over 2 million, which was pretty exciting. It's exciting when you take time to create something and it resonates. So thank you to everyone who keeps coming back. So let's talk about the August 28th, 1963 March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom. I know this is an unusual place for me to start, but let's start with a tweet from Republican Speaker of the House, Kevin McCarthy. It's been 60 years since Martin Luther King Jr. inspired a nation with his powerful I Have a Dream speech. He was right then, and he's right today. We should all be judged not by the color of our skin, but by the content of our character. Ah, yes. The go-to quote for those on the right. The people who now claim to revere Martin Luther King Jr. and what he stood for, despite presently standing against every attempt at progress that MLK helped set into motion. Kevin McCarthy, the same guy who has cozied up to Marjorie Taylor Greene, a woman who has advanced racist and anti-Semitic conspiracy theories, who has appeared and given a speech at a racist conference organized by noted white supremacist Nick Fuentes, the same vile white supremacist who dined with former president and current Republican frontrunner Donald Trump just last year, the same Donald Trump that Kevin McCarthy is desperate to appease and reelect. You have to wonder, where would some of these figures, who now look to the most mild of MLK quotes to feign support for justice and equality, where would they have landed on these issues back in 1963? Well, Gallup, a nonpartisan organization dedicated to illuminating important data trends, they've tracked favorability ratings for MLK over the years. As we look at this graph, you can see that in 1963, Americans were divided in their views, with nearly as many Americans holding an unfavorable view, 37%, as holding a favorable view, 41%. But their views grow more negative as we look to 1966, just 2 years before he was assassinated. According to this Gallup poll, Americans were nearly twice as likely to have a negative, 63%, as a positive, 33%, opinion of MLK in 1966. Fast forward to 2011, and the numbers tell a completely different story, with the vast majority of Americans surveyed indicating they have a favorable, even highly favorable view of MLK. This is telling because we hear from the right wing endlessly an emphasis on MLK's peaceful approach, quote unquote, peaceful approach, implying that there is a very narrow and correct path one should take to secure equal rights, as though his peaceful approach was widely supported at the time. But this is a rewriting of history, because this was clearly not the case in MLK's prime activist days. The reality is that regardless of how the message in support of racial justice is delivered in this country, wide swaths of the electorate will say, not like that, not right now, all things in due time. And MLK spoke to that directly in his April 1963 letter from a Birmingham jail. King was jailed after defying an Alabama court injunction and leading a march of black protesters without a permit while urging a boycott of white-owned stores on Easter. At the time, King received criticism from white clergymen who disagreed with his attempts to organize for racial justice, including the march and other demonstrations. King responded in his letter, and I'm going to play just a brief section of that letter for you now.
First, I must confess that over the past few years I have been gravely disappointed with the white moderate. I have almost reached the regrettable conclusion that the Negro's great stumbling block in his stride toward freedom is not the white citizens' counselor or the Ku Klux Klaner, but the white moderate, who is more devoted to order than to justice, who prefers a negative peace, which is the absence of tension, to a positive peace, which is the presence of justice, who constantly says, I agree with you in the goal you seek, but I cannot agree with your methods of direct action, who paternalistically believes he can set the timetable for another man's freedom, who lives by a mythical concept of time, and who constantly advises the Negro to wait for a more convenient season. Shallow understanding from people of goodwill is more frustrating than absolute misunderstanding from people of ill will. Lukewarm acceptance is much more bewildering than outright rejection.
So if you're watching this now and you're white, I want you to think about whether you fit the description of the white moderate MLK just described. Have you made similar arguments about Black Lives Matter, for example? Have you been more focused on the methods of protest used than the injustices that provoke those protests? And what might you be able to do to change that? I can tell you this, you won't see people like Kevin McCarthy quoting this section on the white moderate in celebration of MLK or the anniversary of the March on Washington. And that's because Kevin McCarthy would have been handing out unfavorability ratings to MLK back in the 60s. He would have been criticizing the methods and the timetables during the March on Washington, which at the time had majority disapproval from Americans. Reading from Gallup, quote, in August 1963, Gallup found considerable public opposition to the now famous Civil Rights March on Washington, in which King delivered his I Have a Dream speech. The poll was conducted about 2 weeks before the march, at which time 71% were familiar with the, quote, proposed mass civil rights rally to be held in Washington, D.C. on August 28th. Of those who were familiar, only 23% said they had a favorable view of the rally. 42% had an unfavorable view of it, including 7% who predicted violence would occur, and 18% said it wouldn't accomplish anything. In May 1964, Gallup asked, do you think mass demonstrations are more likely to help or more likely to hurt the cause for racial equality? In response, only 16% of Americans, including just 10% of whites and 55% of non-whites, said such mass demonstrations would help the cause. So as we look back on history and how meaningful the March on Washington was for the civil rights movement, we see that very much like the fight for civil rights today, there was widespread disapproval and backlash. Many people saying, no, not like that, not right now. And we can't complete this retrospective without looking at the context of racist violence that continues to this day. Over the weekend, 3 Black people were murdered because they were Black by a dangerous, virulent white supremacist who followed the playbook for other dangerous, virulent white supremacists, leaving behind a manifesto, evidence of his radicalization by the right wing, who cannot and will not stop attacking the woke ideology and stoking fears over the racist conspiracy theory that is white replacement, and working overtime to prevent the teaching of Black history, otherwise known as American history, in schools. We recently learned of the 6 Mississippi cops who just pleaded guilty to torturing 2 Black men because they were Black. The racist cops who were arrested in California, exposing their vile racist texts with dozens of officers on the text thread. This all just in the past month, and I'm sure I'm missing other stories. So what should be clear on this 60th anniversary of the March on Washington is that we still very much have a white supremacy problem in this country, a white supremacy problem that is propped up and promoted by a Republican Party that gives aid and comfort to white supremacists in its policies that it promotes and the figures that it chooses to dine with. I want people like Kevin McCarthy to understand that where you stand on racial justice today is where you would have stood in 1963. You may think that you would have been out in the streets marching with MLK and other activists, but if you're not doing that now, what makes you think you'd be doing that in the 60s? If you're standing in the way right now, you'd be standing in the way then. If you're wasting time talking about methods of protest and when the right time is now, you'd be the target of that letter from the Birmingham jail then. The fight for racial justice and against white supremacy is not over. And we all have the opportunity right now to get in the fight. I won't hold my breath for Kevin McCarthy, but I have hope that those of you watching this right now are ready to do more to get involved and ensure there is progress where there has not yet been even close to enough. What do you think? I'd love to know. You can leave a voicemail at 657-464-7609, or you can send an email to idoubitit@dollemore.com. You can also support my work on Patreon, patreon.com/idoubtitpodcast. Do me a favor and send this video to someone you think needs to hear it. Take care, and I'll see you next time.